Now it gives me great pleasure to honor and to welcome one of MEI's most distinguished board members, Ambassador Richard Murphy. Ambassador Murphy will introduce our keynote speaker this evening, Deputy Secretary of State William Burns. Ambassador Murphy has had an impressive career in the American Foreign Service over 40 years. He's been ambassador to Syria, Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, and the Philippines. He obtained the career rank of Career Ambassador. That's as high as you can go. And he was appointed Assistant Secretary for the Near East and South Asia Bureau by President Ronald Reagan in 1984. And in addition to serving on the Middle East Institute Board for a period as chairman, we also shamelessly double-task him as one of our scholars. So please welcome Ambassador Richard Murphy.
Thank you all in attendance. And as a retired member of our Foreign Service, it's a real honor for me to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Deputy Secretary of State William Burns. Bill and I go back quite a long way to 1984, when he first started working for me as a staff assistant in the Bureau of Near East and Near Eastern Affairs. In those days, it was Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs. 1984 was, for those of us in the Bureau, a normal year. There was the Red Army in Afghanistan, the Iran-Iraq War, the Lebanese Civil War. Those were a few of the issues we were dealing with. Bill was exceptionally well organized, and he made our often extended trips through the area, one of which lasted, as I recall it, a full month, and extremely smooth going. I hadn't known him before that. I didn't realize he was already a published author. His book, Economic Aid and American Policy Towards Egypt, 1955-1981, was published after his starting work at State. Clearly a thoughtful, carefully researched piece of work. What strikes the casual reader is that in addition to 220 pages of text, there were 64 pages of footnotes and appendices. Thorough is the word. It didn't take me more than a few weeks working with Bill to realize this was a very impressive young man who was going to go a long way, although, to be honest, I didn't expect him to go as far as he's gone. It was, in those days, unheard of for a Foreign Service officer to get nominated for the job of Deputy Secretary. But even then, he had the goods, what some 10 years later, Time magazine, in a profile hailed as, quote, his brilliance, unflappable demeanor, and flair for self-effacement in a field where titanic egos often clash, making him the fastest-rising career diplomat of his generation. Rather more vivid writing than the Foreign Service produces. Indeed, Bill is a man who's impressed foreign leaders and Middle East policy professionals since his entrance into the service almost 30 years ago. He completed his first ambassadorial tour in Jordan from 1998 to 2001, before serving as Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs till 2005. He then moved to Russia, where he served as U.S. Ambassador till 2008. In May of that year, he gave up that post to serve as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, a job he held until President Obama nominated him as Deputy Secretary earlier this year, and he does hold the rank of Career Ambassador. He's been instrumental in dealing with the toughest issues the United States has had to face under any president: Iran, Russia, Syria, Egypt, Israeli-Arab relations. Perhaps most impressive through all these crises and titanic egos that he's dealt with, he's always remained a man almost everyone he meets calls a genuinely nice guy. A gentleman with the inner toughness of a rugby player. I could go on about Bill, his language abilities in Russian and Arabic, or his honorary degrees and presidential awards, but you get the picture. This is an extraordinary diplomat and person. We're honored he agreed to deliver our keynote address this evening. Please join me in welcoming the Deputy Secretary of State, the Honorable William Burns.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Dick, for that extraordinarily kind introduction. I'm honored to be back at the Middle East Institute, for whose leadership, membership, and mission I have enormous respect. And I'm especially honored to be introduced by Dick Murphy, for whom I have the greatest admiration and from whom I've learned a great deal. The truth is, there's no better model of skill and professionalism and decency in American diplomacy than Dick Murphy. I'm privileged to share this podium with your two deeply deserving award winners this evening, Esraa Fattah and Lakhdar Brahimi. You both have changed history, you both have changed the world for the better, and you both represent the very best in what courageous public advocacy and selfless, skillful public service can accomplish. I was fortunate to speak at this same event 2 years ago, and I'm very fortunate to be invited back. Whenever I think of repeat performances, I'm reminded of a story involving George Bernard Shaw and Winston Churchill. It seems that Shaw sent Churchill 2 tickets to the opening night performance of his new play. Along with this gift, he included a note that read, "Here are 2 tickets to my new play. Bring a friend if you have one." To which Churchill wrote back with his usual diplomatic subtlety, "Sorry, but I can't make it to the opening night performance. Please send me tickets to the second performance, if there is one." So I'm glad to be back for a second performance this evening. Since I was last here, we've all witnessed a wave of historic change in the Middle East, as consequential in its own way as the changes that emerged so dramatically out of Europe and Eurasia 2 decades ago. 2011 has been a truly transformative year. It brought us the first successful popular revolution in the region in over 30 years, and then the second and the third. And as the brave citizens of Syria are showing every day, another revolution is underway, aimed firmly at realizing the long-suppressed universal rights of the Syrian people. It all began when a desperate Tunisian street vendor, tired of too many indignities and too many lost hopes, set fire to himself and sparked a revolution still burning across an entire region. That single act, at once tragic and noble, symbolic and catalytic, has brought the Middle East to a moment of profound transformation, one that was unimaginable when I worked for Dick Murphy a quarter century ago. Importantly, it is a transformation truly driven from within. It is not about us, as tempting as it often is for Americans to think in those self-absorbed terms. But even if it is not about us, it certainly matters enormously to us. A workable American strategy for a rapidly changing Middle East has several dimensions. In recent months, both President Obama and Secretary Clinton have spoken about this in detail. So tonight I'd like to focus on 2 of these dimensions. First, support for greater political openness and the democratic transitions unfolding in different ways across the region. And second, support for the economic openness and opportunities which are critical to the success of those transitions. I fully recognize that no American strategy can succeed based on those 2 elements of policy alone. We face growing challenges in regional security, particularly given the threat posed by Iran's nuclear ambitions and serial interference in the affairs of its neighbors. There has never been a moment when strengthening our security cooperation with our GCC partners mattered more. Nor is there a more important task before us than continuing to build a strong partnership with Iraq and encouraging its reintegration into the Arab world. Similarly, we simply cannot afford to neglect the unfinished business of Middle East peace. Some people saw the absence of banners criticizing Israel or supporting Palestine among the hundreds of thousands of Egyptians gathered in Tahrir Square at the beginning of the year as a sign that the Palestinian issue no longer mattered so much. Nothing could be further from the truth. The status quo between Palestinians and Israelis remains combustible and unsteady, and it is no more sustainable than the sclerotic political systems that have crumbled in recent months. As President Obama said in his speech at the State Department on May 19th, we all know that a lasting peace will involve two states for two peoples. Israel as a Jewish state and the homeland for the Jewish people, and the state of Palestine as the homeland for the Palestinian people. The core issues of the conflict must be negotiated, but the basis of those negotiations is clear: a viable Palestine, a secure Israel. The President also offered key principles to guide negotiations on borders and security. I wish I could say that we've made substantial progress toward realizing the President's vision. I cannot. As all of you in this knowledgeable and committed audience know, the reality is a lot more sobering. Despite exhaustive efforts, we are not where we need to be. But we're determined to press ahead with our partners in the Quartet and in the region. The President laid out a vision with the elements for successful negotiations, and it is crucial for the parties to respond and use what he offered to break the impasse. If the pursuit of regional security and Arab-Israeli peace remain core ingredients in our strategy, the past year has driven home another truth: that stability is not a static phenomenon, and that support for democratic transitions and economic opportunity are also extraordinarily important ingredients in successful American strategy. 2 years ago, I spoke here at MEI about the dangerous shortage of economic and political hope confronting the region. I recall that with an ample dose of humility. It was hardly a novel thought, and anyone who had read the Arab Human Development reports over the past decade could see the tinder that was accumulating, even if it was very hard to see what exactly would happen when a spark was lit. The truth is that this is a moment of enormous promise for people and societies who for far too long have known far too little freedom, far too little opportunity, and far too little dignity. It is a moment of great possibility for American policy, a moment when homegrown, people-driven protests have repudiated al-Qaeda's false narrative that change can only come through violence and extremism. But it is also a moment of considerable risk, because there is nothing automatic or preordained about the success of such transitions. As much as it is in our interest to support the emergence of more transparent, more accountable, and more responsive governments that will ultimately make stronger and more stable partners, the journey is likely to be very complicated, very uneven, and at times very unsettling. We must accept that democratic transitions are often messy and unpredictable. We must accept democratic choices and engage with all emerging political forces committed to pluralism and nonviolence. And we must reject the old dictator's conceit that we really have only two choices: the autocrats you know or the Islamic extremists you fear. Furthermore, we must accept that we're going to have differences with democratic governments, sometimes significant differences. Governments that are accountable to their populations are going to behave differently than autocratic governments did. It won't always be easy to work with them. We also know from transitions in other regions that there is a danger of authoritarian retrenchment or violent instability, especially if economic stagnation persists and newly elected leaders don't produce practical improvements in people's daily lives. For these reasons, we have a huge stake in the success of post-revolutionary transitions where citizens are seeking inclusive political systems where none existed before.